In order to have a good understanding of DNA and RNA, genetics, heredity, we need to know something about the chemistry of DNA. So we know we have it. We know that it makes a life form. We know that all cells, except for our red blood cells, all other cells on the planet have DNA. And bacteria don't have it in a nucleus, but eukaryotes, which is the group that we belong to, do. We have DNA in our nucleus. And indeed, we have DNA in our nucleus that is transcribed into RNA, which is shot out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm, latches onto ribosomes, and then that RNA is translated into proteins, which is what we are. We are a protein-based life form here on Earth. And one difference we'll emphasize today is the difference between DNA and RNA. And the coronavirus is an RNA virus. There are some viruses that have DNA, but the coronavirus is an RNA virus. So we'll look at those structures. Oh, I talk so much, shut off. Alrighty. DNA is an organic molecule. If you recall, an organic molecule is one that has a carbon hydroskeleton, a hydrocarbon skeleton. We're made of carbon. Our large macromolecules are carbon. And we looked at lipids, we looked at proteins, we looked at carbohydrates, but we did not yet look at nucleotides. So nucleotides are the last macromolecule to discuss. A nucleotide has three, count them, three principal components. A nitrogenous base, which can be a single or double carbon nitrogen ring, a sugar, monosaccharide, and one or more phosphate groups. That makes a nucleotide. And nucleotides are not only in DNA and RNA, but also in our magic molecule of energy, ATP. ATP is a nucleotide that contains a nitrogenous base called adenine. It contains a sugar called ribose, and it contains not one, not two, but three phosphate groups. And there's something very special about phosphate groups. They have a charge. My question to you is that charge negative charge or positive charge? What is the charge on a phosphate group? And you can write that in the chat. What kind of a charge? Negative. Yes, a negatively charged group. They're all negatively charged. They're very close to each other. They're covalently bonded, but those bonds are not very strong. It makes it unstable. And unstable means energetic. So ATP, for that reason, is the universal energy carrying molecule. So we've got your adenine, phosphate, phosphate, phosphate group. Often this is a squiggly line. So the negative groups repel each other. Therefore, it's very easy for this bond to break. Easily broken bond. And then that phosphate can be used attached to other things to cause them to function in some way, like change their shape, for example. ATP, simply marvelous. Very high energy. High energy covalent bonds. Why? Because they're weak. It sounds sort of counterintuitive, doesn't it? But that's why they have a lot of energy, because they can just repel the other ones off to do some other work. The other work that is done is for that phosphate group to attach to something else. So how does that phosphate group come off in the first place? With an enzyme, as you could imagine, and as many enzymes are named for what they work on and end with A's, it's called, cleverly, ATPase. It hydrolyzes, breaks the third high energy phosphate bond of ATP, producing ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and a phosphate group, and little inorganic phosphate group. That's why it's the I there. It doesn't have a carbon anymore. So yeah, there's that phosphate group. Oh, it's just floating around. What should I do? Well, it can be attached to another enzyme, and that attachment gets attached elsewhere, like say on your muscles to activate the myosin and actin for contraction. Gets attached elsewhere by the phosphokinases. A kinase is an activating enzyme. It activates other enzymes. It activates other things. This one is called a phosphokinase. It attaches the phosphate group to another molecule, and that's called phosphorylation. Phosphorylation. Enzymes that phosphorylate, they add that little phosphate group to other enzymes or molecules, and that activates them. Yeah, so that process is called phosphorylation. It happens with amazing frequency. Indeed, if you were to not make any new ATP within 1 minute, all your ATP would be gone. You wouldn't have any. You wouldn't be able to do anything. So fortunately for us, though, ATP is made all the time in every cell because we eat and we have glucose that goes through cellular respiration, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. Yeah, ATP, this is what it looks like. A molecular structure. So as nitrogenous bases will have, they have rings, sometimes single rings. This time it's a double ring. Ring and a ring, 2 rings. And that's the nitrogenous base. It's called nitrogenous because, look, it has these nitrogens that are covalently bonded to this ringed structure. It also has a sugar. So this is the sugar. It's called ribose. It is a 5-carbon sugar. You always assume that there's a carbon at the corner if it doesn't say carbon. So here is a carbon, 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 and this carbon is also attached. So it's a 5-carbon sugar. And of course, the third and most important group is the triphosphate group, adenosine triphosphate. Well, we need it. We need it because it's used for all of our energetic functions, chemical reactions, enzymes, transportation. And we get it because we convert glucose. We use oxygen. This process is known as cellular respiration. And the reason that it's possible is because originally plants used the sun to make glucose by photosynthesis. Interestingly, so they make this glucose molecule, which is relatively unstable, especially when it comes to oxygen. Oxygen, super reactive. Oxygen is highly, if you recall, electronegative. It draws electrons to itself so strongly indeed that it causes the hydrolyzation of glucose, splits it, just completely splits it. But in a number of stages, it doesn't happen all at once. It is a number of stages. So cellular respiration, the process takes a glucose molecule, but not always glucose. Sometimes there are other molecules involved, like fat molecules, fatty acids. and oxygen, in this case, they're converted to carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, and water. This process is an exogonic process. In other words, it makes energy. It's spontaneous. It's spontaneous. In order for it to happen quickly, it needs enzymes. Nevertheless, it doesn't require an input of energy, at least not a net input. The net is an output of energy. And that energy, in the form of ATP, that energy is used to synthesize, used for synthesis of ATP from adenosine diphosphate, which is in abundance in our cells, as well as the inorganic phosphate group. And then it's available for all of these things: contracting muscles, the beating of the ciliary in your trachea and your bronchi, the active transport across your plasma membrane, any kind of synthesis reaction, making glycogen, for example, for storage. Synthesis requires energy. That's where it comes from, ATP. How does it happen? This is a longer explanation of cellular respiration. Cellular respiration, first stage. Whoops, oh dear. First stage is called glycolysis. Glyco for the glucose, lysis means to split. Glycolysis, so it splits 1 6-carbon glucose into 2 3-carbon pyruvic acid molecules. That gets us 2 ATPs. Well, that's terrific. It's not too much though. But if we don't have any oxygen, it's got to be enough. So if there's no oxygen available, pyruvic acid is converted to lactic acid. So if you have been exercising, and you've used up a lot of the oxygen that's stored in your body, well, you'll start to get energy via an anaerobic process. And lactic acid is the product of that. There's a little bit of ATP produced. The beauty of it is that it allows glycolysis to start all over again. So it is a cyclic thing. You can get ATP, although not too much, anaerobically or without oxygen. However, aerobically, we get way more and it's really efficient. So if oxygen is available, remember, oxygen's highly reactive, electronegative, it pulls electrons towards it, and is very efficiently consumed in the rest of cellular respiration. And you know, in this class, we're not going to go through it step by step by step by step by step. There are many steps. They're all reduction oxidation steps. They all happen in the mitochondria. In many steps, redox steps. So lots of molecules are more electronegative than others. So there's this like kind of a stairway of electrons moving from one molecule to the next until it gets to the oxygen in the end. I'll show you NAD in just a moment. So this process, which is amazing and wonderful, and the reason that we have an energy at all, produces out of 36 ADP and the inorganic phosphate, 36 ATP molecules. And it's happening by the millions per second in the body. So here's an overview. Glycolysis, a couple of ATPs, maybe anaerobic if we don't have oxygen, aerobic if we have oxygen, and we get this lovely number of ATPs that we require. So NAD is a molecule that transports electrons in cellular respiration. It's a delivery molecule. It takes the electrons along with hydrogen from glucose, and it delivers it to the last stage of cellular respiration. Other nucleotides of interest are a guanosine triphosphate, GTP. It is also sometimes instrumental in donating a phosphate group to other molecules or to ADP for the production of ATP. Cyclic adenosine monophosphate, mono meaning one, only one phosphate group. It's called CAMP. And if you remove both high energy phosphate groups, then it triggers the conversion of ATP to cyclic AMP. Now it only has one, but cyclic AMP has a very interesting function in the cell. It's a second messenger system. So it activates effects inside the cell. It's a second messenger because the first messenger, which is usually a hormone, has triggered it to be produced inside the cell. And nucleic acids are polymers of nucleotides. Remember, a polymer is a long string of monomers. So here's cyclic AMP. It has a nitrogenous base also. It keeps that, it keeps the sugar, but it only has one phosphate group. But it's very effective. So the other molecule, the other macromolecule in question that we haven't talked about are the nucleic acids. They are DNA and RNA. DNA is known as deoxyribonucleic acid. It's 100 million to 1 billion nucleotides long, contains our genetic code for all of our functions, cell division, reproduction, and the instructions for protein synthesis. And that's our next topic. RNA, ribonucleic acid, it has three forms. It's smaller, 70 to 10,000 or so nucleotides long. It carries out the instructions given by DNA and synthesizes proteins. And that is our next topic. The coronavirus is, its genetic material is RNA. And I'd like to look at that a little bit too in our next topic. All right, so thank you for watching, and we'll move on to DNA and genetics.